it's that goes back. That even predates us, which I didn't think anything did.
No.
I thought it was silent movies before then.
Yeah.
Right. Can we start with you, Peter, by saying a few words about Humphrey Jennings and his use of sound in things like Listen to Britain?
Listen to Britain was really an illustrated soundtrack. He got the idea of the picture from the soundtrack. And the same with Diary for Timothy, which followed that. A very similar sort of picture. He was always a very sound-conscious man.
Right. Now, when he first started, his cameras were very noisy. And what problems did this create for recording sound, and how was it got around?
When we first started what?
When you, in the, say about the early 60s, before sound cameras properly came around, you would have post-synced and you would have recorded a guide track, for instance.
Yeah, but the cameras were always blimped.
Yeah.
Except in the case of the small Arriflex, which would use for pickup shots or handheld shots or something like that. But the large camera that you'd shoot a sync scene with was blimped, so it wasn't noisy. It wasn't nearly as noisy as some of the more modern cameras. They were properly blimped. They were very large and cumbersome because of the size of the blimp. In the case of 3-strip Technicolor, the blimp was lead lined, and you couldn't move the camera with the blimp with block and tackle. Impossible to lift it. It wasn't the camera noise that was the problem. Generator noise was the problem sometimes. If you had lights and you had a generator running, the generator was very noisy.
I mean, the cameras made a noise, but in order to overcome that so you could shoot sound, they put these blimps around, and as Peter just said, the Technicolor blimp, you needed 4 riggers if you wanted to manhandle the blimp. It was so heavy and huge with the 3-strip camera inside it. But you didn't get camera noise because they put a soundproofing around the camera.
Yeah, but on the early free cinema films when Tony was starting, such as the films such as We Are Lambeth Boys, Every Day Except Christmas, and Mama Don't Allow, they used handheld cameras which did create a fair amount of noise, I believe.
A lot of noise, yes. But you would have to post sync. You couldn't do a whole film with a handheld Arriflex and hope to use a soundtrack.
But you would still record a guide track.
Oh yes, you record a guide track. But if you're doing a documentary, there's no great problem unless you've got sync dialogue. If you've got sync dialogue, you're in trouble. You've got to record a guide track.
You'd always record a guide track, because if you're going to loop it, the artist needed a reference to what they'd said and the pauses in their dialogue and how they projected it. So you always had to have the guide track so that when they came into a theatre to redo the sound, they put a headphone on. They can see themselves speaking on the screen, so they can get the lip sync right, and also they would hear how they said it. I'd say they usually have one headphone instead of just 2. So that you would always need a guide track to reproduce that sound in a closed environment, so that they would know exactly what they said, pauses and breaths and stutters and whatever. So always, as Peter said, you would be shooting a guide track. Again, I was thinking of a picture. I think you were involved with Mademoiselle herself from Gibraltar. Yeah. Although that camera was blimped, the cameraman, which I think is the French cameraman, he didn't like the front glass.
No, David Watkin.
Was it Mademoiselle?
David Watkin, yes.
And he didn't want the front glass.
He didn't like the front. He still doesn't like the front
glass in the camera. So therefore, instead of the sound being encased in a blimp, which the blimp was on, but nevertheless, without a front glass, a certain amount of sound comes out. So that isn't good news as far as the sound man is concerned.
But Tony Richardson in particular liked shooting on location, and you like to use original sound, I believe, didn't he? Can you say something about recording in enclosed locations on actuality, right, as against a stage location.
Yes, I mean, the trick is to know when to give up, really. You mustn't fool everybody. The worst thing of all is to say, well, I think I can get this better, and then you can't. And you waste a lot of everybody's time waiting to try and say a background noise stops or something like that. And then you find in the end that you still have to post-sync it. That's terrible.
And that means additional takes, presumably.
Well, not only additional text, but while you're trying, it's a compromise.
Waste of time.
While you're trying to get the sound as well as you can get it, you are of course holding up the big money. You're holding up the stars of the picture who are sitting about doing nothing. The director, all the crew around you. So if a speaker says you try and try and try, but even trying your very best, you still can't get it. It still has to be looped, post-synced, ADR. Whatever terminology you want to put to it, you in the meantime have cost the production a lot of money because you're saying, no, let's wait, let's try and do the work, let's wait till the aircraft disappears, let's wait till that train noise goes, things. Every film and everything is commercial, so it's a fine balance to decide, yes, let's wait and get the original, which is by far the best, better than looping it, or let them get the pictures and we'll have to redo the sound back in the studio.
Can you say something about the practicalities of recording sound before the advent of recorders such as the Nagra 3, which was really the first portable one, specifically recording on film and using that please?
Recording on film was no great problem, except that you had to use very heavy equipment in or out of a sound truck. You could take it out of a sound truck. In some cases, you had what was laughingly called a portable recorder, which took 4 men to move it with all the batteries and the ancillary equipment. But after that came a terrible thing, which really killed the mystique of sound recording, called Levers Rich. Now, Levers Rich ran in synchronism with the camera, but if the camera speed altered, the speed of the tape altered, because it had a pulse, a recorded pulse from the camera motor onto the tape. And when they transferred the tape onto 35mm film, you had to follow the speed of the pulse, in other words, the speed of the camera. So the frequency of the recording would alter, and you'd get voice going in an extreme case, and you'd sit there with 2 little boxes instead of a rather impressive mixer and a huge soundtrack. And most of the sound was unusable because of this frequency problem. You certainly couldn't record music on it.
I remember on quite a few old films, particularly with clarinet tracks and the pitch varying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or a piano, you'd get it.
I'm thinking of Jack Clayton's The Pumpkin Eater, if you remember that.
Yes, I do.
Yes, I worked on that.
Right. So.
But nevertheless, you see, Saturday night, Sunday morning, The Entertainer were shot on this Levers Rich equipment. But when we had to record music, you see, when we went to Morecambe, where all the interior theatre scenes were shot, they had originally recorded the playback tracks at Wijgerden Studios before the picture started. When we got to Morecambe, and they had the theatre orchestra at the Alhambra Theatre, they played so badly, trying to play well, that Tony said, well, this is wonderful, we've got to record them again. Because good musicians playing badly don't sound like bad musicians trying to play well. So we had to scrap all the playback tracks, and we had to send for another recorder from Shepperton and record the music again in the Alhambra Theatre Morecambe, which was fine, because also we had a lot of playback. And we used to transfer from the recording that we'd done originally to make a playback track for Laurence Olivier to do his turns or something like that. And I used to say to Tony, now, are you quite sure that you've finished with all the scenes of this? And he'd say yes. I said, because we've got to send the master track back to Shepperton for the cutting room. One day he suddenly said, oh, now we've got to do this scene. I said, well, I'm sorry, Tony, the original track's got back, we've got no playback track left of it. Oh, what do we do? So I said, well, there's only one thing to do. We'll ring up John Cox at Shepperton, tell him to have the master track standing by in the transfer suite, and we'll record it over the telephone, which we did. And in the middle of the track, the 3 pips went. There were the days when the 3 pips at the end of 3 minutes. And Tony thought this was marvellous, super. He said, I've never heard anything as good in my life. It was wonderful.
You're getting the accent.
But it worked.
Yeah.
It worked. I mean, it was the right sync. You know, we did it.
Is there anything in particular you'd like to say about Tony's use of recording sound or the way he dubbed it?
He was never frightened of silences, where in today's dubbing, if there's a gap between dialogues, the style is you've got to fill it with an offstage noise or something. He couldn't. The scene in Charge, the scene in the boat, the famous scene where all you do is hearing the creak of the boats going on there. He would let something go silent and just on an atmosphere, where today, I think with the advent of TV, something's always got to be happening, and you've always got, you've got to be, sound's got to be off stage and noises and everything. Tony wouldn't mind letting the soundtrack go quiet for a minute, 2 minutes, and just play it. He would stylize a scene. I'm not saying it wasn't done before, but it was the first time that I came into contact with it. That he was doing things that other directors at that time weren't doing. It might have, maybe done in other pictures, and has been done since. But certainly it was new to me. And his whole method, his whole approach of that period was very refreshing, and very exciting. It was.
He was also very keen to use sound effects, much more than people had before.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, starting with Tom Jones, the hunt sequence, where there's no music at all. You know, he insisted on using sound effects only. And Jock Addison always says he got the Oscar on the strength of that hunt sequence, where everybody had complimented him on the music, and there wasn't any. It was all done with sound effects.
Because you recorded some special effects for the Charge of the Light Brigade.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of the job of a production mixer is to record the sound effect. You talked about post-syncing and guide tracks and so on. If you've got a scene where you know it's going to be post-synced and you've recorded a guide track, you must try to go away and get a background effects track to match that shot. Otherwise, it's very difficult for the sound editor later on to find out an appropriate effects track.
This is what we call Atmos today.
Yeah, Atmos.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so that when you've done, if like in the Charge, that when you've redone the voices, you now have got to put back into the soundtrack the galloping horses, the birds, the wind, the jangle of their harness and the gunshots, everything. And we were talking of Charge, and Peter went, I think it was Salisbury Plain, wasn't it? He went down to shoot the guns.
Yeah.
So that we got authentic rifle shots of the period that we could then dub into the final soundtrack. And all those things are supplied to us by the recordist on the picture, and then are mixed together in a dubbing room behind the scene.
So how many tracks would you typically use for this now?
On a picture like Charge, you'd be running for every reel, which, as you know, lasts 10 minutes per one reel. You'll be running 60, 70 separate tracks, dialogues, music, and effects. of all the movements of the people involved in the scene, loosely called footsteps, or if you're American, they're called Foleys, and all the birds and winds and music and dialogue. In the sea sequence, the lapping of the waves outside and creaking of the boats, and then it's all mixed together in a level which is to get the correct atmosphere for the scene that you are in. That in conjunction with conversations with the director, that's what he's conveying.
So how much control would Tony have over mixing them? Would he say feature this bit rather than this bit higher at a higher level than this? Or?
Oh, I mean, it would be totally down. It'd be to him. Like again, coming back to Charge, because he was looking for locations for his next picture when we were dubbing Charge, which was in fact Laughter in the Dark. Most of that film we dubbed without Tony being with us. But having said all that, we'd spent hours, days, weeks discussing, and having been doing rough dubs, test dubs. So, and also having worked with Tony before, you know the style that he's going for, but he's also talked us all through, and we've discussed each reel and each scene many times before the final mix. So when you come to the final mix, you know what he wants and what he's after. Although, having said that, for the last reels, which was The Charge, and you could have done the soundtrack for that in at least 2 or 3 ways, and neither would be wrong. It's a subjective thing. We phoned up the office and said, look, because we hadn't really gone into that, and at the time we discussed it, we hadn't had Jock's music. So I wanted Tony around to make sure that, as it was the definitive statement of the picture, to make sure that we were interpreting his wishes correctly. And they finally, I think he was in Sardinia, that they they tracked him down, location hunting for Laughter, and we were working the weekend on that, and he finally arrived at lunchtime, wasn't it, on the Sunday?
Lunchtime on Sunday.
And said, do you realise you've got me up at 3 o'clock in the morning in order to catch a flight back here to do this? What do you want? So, and he was saying that with a large tongue in his cheek, and he knew we would have asked him back without good reason. And then we proceeded to dub the final reel, the Charge.
Was there ever a situation where you were going to the dubbing and you found you needed a particular sound? If you did, would you go for a already recorded sound of what we'd use today, like a set of CD discs, or would you go back and to the actuality and record that piece of?
It would depend entirely on the sound you're looking for. I mean, as you know, there's big libraries, and they've been around for a long time. So it could be a library effect that you want. If it was a specific sound that you required, then undoubtedly you would have to get a sound crew and go out and record it. But that wouldn't happen. You would have known that before final mixing time, and you'd have done that before you came into the final mix. That would be in the preparation stage. You would have discovered that you needed this specific sound for whatever reason, and you'd have got it recorded and then sunk up to the picture wherever you wanted to play.
Because you can go to a lot of trouble just to record one little sound effect that lasts.
Oh sure.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh, you do that all the time.
Right.
And particularly nowadays, where that you get scientific type pictures and that you have these weird and wonderful effects going on, which has got to be harmonized and synthesized and every otherized to get it. So that preparation is done coming up to the final mix, so that you have that effect ready to be mixed in.
Yeah, part of cinema verite believed that this was roughly the same time. Believed that sound was only valid if it was recorded at the particular time. If that sound went with that particular thing, do you think that that type of sound is any more valid than sound that's been mixed and brought in, synthesised from soundtracks? And
I think there's a lot of validity in the. I don't think you can beat the original soundtrack. Now there are exceptions, obviously, to every rule. The obvious one we talked about is if you're shooting a period picture, and out of sight an aircraft noise go over. Obviously, that is unacceptable to the picture, that you have a modern sound in a period picture, and it mustn't be too much of an irritant to the audience that the sound, they are straining to hear the dialogue, because then I don't think it, although they might not be conscious of the fact that they're straining to hear it, it's an annoyance to them that they're not certain whether they should be hearing the dialogue or whether it's throwaway lines. That, I think, then I would advocate that you redo that sound rather than make it an irritant to the audience. But with that proviso, the sync track, 9 times out of 10, the performance by the artists is better than they reproduce in a controlled environment. When they are actually playing the scene, one artist against another, they're bouncing off one another more than they can, although they try and they go to great lengths to reproduce it, and depending on the artist, very successfully. You'll get some artists that can reproduce it exactly as they did it on the original. Other ones, they find it more difficult to give the performance and to also have to be conscious of the technicalities involved, and that is they've got to set it at exactly the same speed as they did it in the original. So they're half thinking about the technical aspect as well as the playing aspect. Some of them find it difficult, others could just drop into it. Stanley Baker could do it, Dirk Bogarde, they can reproduce what they did on the night like that and rip through their performance and give you the same performance as they did on the original. Others find it more difficult.
How
You
did
can
that?
do wonders with a wild track, actually, too,
Yes.
sometimes.
Yes, indeed.
If you can persuade everybody to keep quiet. If, say, something goes wrong, for instance, if you're tracking a camera, it may make a terrible noise at one time. You can then replay the scene without the camera, just for the dialogue. And with good actors, it's astonishing how near to perfection they get with it. And the sound editor can usually fit the tracks.
How did you get on with so many of the new actors that Tony Richardson introduced? Well,
It's a whole string of them.
yeah, there's so many. He liked particularly working with new actors, and there must have been some teaching involved.
Peter would be more
No.
involved in that side. By the time it comes to me, they've done it.
No, because he was very good. Tony's great strength was that he would use everybody, whether actors, technicians, or anybody. He would use their knowledge. If he didn't agree with it, then he wouldn't use it. But he would always give everyone a chance. And before he did a scene, he would take the actors through the whole scene. And if they did something that maybe wasn't in the script, which he liked, he would leave it in the picture. So you get plenty of chance to have a rehearsal and see how it all works out. Not many directors do that, really. They don't use people's experience to the same extent as he did.
What effect did the microphones have? For instance, today we've got lots of the Sennheiser directional microphone, but I believe you had something called a ball and biscuit microphone.
Oh, that's going back a long way.
Yeah.
We had RCA cardioid microphone, and after that AKG. They became more and more directional. The Sennheiser is luxury compared to what we used to have.
Ball and biscuits would have been round in
The 30s and
well,
still after the war.
yeah, I think after the war still
Yeah.
on some. I think you I don't think you used them, but they'd be round at the entertainers' time. Some people were still.
We used AKGs.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a shot from Taste of Honey where they show this little microphone in this circular ball, which is obviously completely undirectional, and then they're holding it on a fish pile above that.
The 630s.
Well, I probably had a reason for using that. If I was recording effects track, you don't necessarily want a directional microphone.
But was that shot in? Was that in picture?
Well, no, it wasn't. The one still I've got of a location.
Oh, still. I beg your pardon. Yes, I thought you
Still.
meant it was actually in the film.
Still, no, the one still of the location shows this circular, and I believe that was common at the time that they used that type of microphone before they got direction.
No, it wasn't. You wouldn't use it for dialogue. Not at that time. That was 1959, 60.
Yeah.
59, 60.
So what equipment was actually in use at that time? For instance, for the entertainment?
AKG cardioid microphone, or RCA.
10,001.
Yeah, 10,001. Yes.
And how good were they?
Very good indeed. Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Heavy.
They probably didn't have the gain that
No.
the ones that have got today, but they had a lot going for them as well. There was a roundness to dialogue that some of the modern microphones don't give you today. As a comparison, it would be a transistor amp against a valve amp. I mean, if you think of all the old films that were shot, all the lovely Warner Brothers pictures, the Bette Davis pictures, and all those, the quality of the dialogue was now that because reproducing the sound, redoing the sound was more tricky, so there was more discipline in order to get a good soundtrack in those days. That was one reason. Another reason that was the microphones were smoother, were rounder. They didn't have the gain of the microphones today, and so in these modern days, you couldn't operate with the microphones of those days today because you've got to have the microphone much farther away in the techniques, and therefore you wouldn't have the gain to get what you want. But there were some pluses for those, the type of microphones Peter's talking about.
Less directional. They weren't
Yeah.
as directional as the Sennheiser.
No,
But
because
don't forget, there's no microphone that's equivalent to a lens. It doesn't exist.
you can't.
That you can't go
Focusing.
into just showing a close-up of the eyes with a microphone, and the microphone is still here, but you can with the camera. Unfortunately, you can't with a microphone unless you actually move the microphone and bring it into you close, which would then be in picture, so it would be rather self-defeating.
So how did you go about microphone placement at that time? Was it purely overhead, or would you?
No, not necessarily. You choose according to... If you've got, say, two people walking on a gravel path and you have the microphone overhead, you're going to get a terrible noise from their footsteps. Now, if you've got a microphone and you come here with the back non-sensitive part of the microphone to the gravel, you'll get a much better pickup from the voice. You get a much better signal-to-noise ratio. You get less gravel and more speech, which is what you want. There's no rule. You just use the best microphone position you can get, depending on where the camera is, what sort of background noise there is, and everything else. You've got to take everything into consideration.
So did you use mixers and multiple mics on locations like today? We use radio mics.
Well, we didn't have radio mics then at the time of Entertainer. We had chest mics, which was a lapel mic, but that had to be on the end of a cable. You had to trail the cable, follow the actor, and be careful not to trip the actor up or to pull him back. I mean, you'd run a cable down the trouser leg or something like that.
So that's how it was done.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And what about the dubbing machinery? I mean, that must have moved a lot since 1960s.
Tremendously, and for the much better. You can now do things on the dubbing desk that just would not have been possible in those days. It was very basic. Oh, you're talking about the 60s?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, even that. Because now, because you go into you can go into memory storage and things on the modern desks, which you didn't have before. The thing about that is you pack more into the soundtrack. The soundtracks, the earlier soundtracks, were minimal. You didn't have the equipment in order to give you all the stuff that is packed into a soundtrack today. And today's technology on the soundtracks is far superior.
But even then, they did manage to. In the time of Humphrey Jennings, managed to put soundtracks together quite well from gramophone records and give an impressionistic look to sound, which could make silent shot films look as though they'd been shot in sound.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
So they were quite sophisticated. To us today.
Yes. The number of tracks involved wouldn't be very great. Where today, in those days, if you'd probably be running 8 tracks or 10 tracks or something.
Yes, at the most.
At the very most.
On a thing like that.
Now, I've done pictures where you're running 100 tracks, 120 tracks on a reel. If you listen to the old pictures, whether it's a Bette Davis picture or some of the big pictures of the 30s and the 40s and things, it's a very basic soundtrack. You get a Laurel and Hardy track, and there's music going throughout it all in the background, just plugging away. You have his dialogue and the car noise or whatever, but it's not a sophisticated track.
Early 60s, there was no rock and roll, was there?
Oh no,
can you just explain what rock and roll is?
Well, up until
mid-60s?
1967, I think. Before about 67, when you started a reel, you had to go all the way to the end and get it correct all the way through. If you made a mistake, you had to go back to the beginning and redo it. Now you could, if it was a really tricky reel, you could say, okay, from the first half of the reel is okay, and you would only do the second half, and then they would splice it together. But basically, you had to do it from frame 1 to the end of the reel. Then what was called rock and roll came in, and so that if you made a mistake, you just sent the film in, you pressed the button, film went into reverse, you roll back a few feet before you'd made the mistake, and then started to roll forward, punched in your record button, it erased what you'd previously done from that moment of time, so you were erasing prior to making the mistake, and then you did the mix, you carried on with the mix, and rectified the fault that you'd made in the mix. So you got to the end of the reel, and that was a complete reel. And that was a revolution to us, that we could update a recording instead of having to go right back to the very beginning. I remember doing only about a year before it came in, I did a picture with Joe Losey called Accident.
Yeah, very famous.
And there was a scene in that, right at the end, where the car comes in Oxford, I think, and the girl is leaving, I think going back to France or wherever she came from. And there's a car going down the drive, and you do a dissolve to an aircraft going away, which is, you don't see her on it, but it's her leaving. And this, obviously, all these things were at the end of the reel. And the assistant who was doing it that time, and in fact, it was his first picture in that position. And each time we got to this thing, he made a mistake on the fade, so we had to go right back to the beginning of the reel and do it all again. And we did it about 3 or 4 times before he finally got the mix. And as it was his first picture, I was loath to say, do you mind if I do it? Because I think it might have destroyed his confidence a little bit. And to the credit of Joe Losey, he just sat there and, we did it over and over again, where other directors might have said,
Enough of this.
Yes. But with rock and roll, that would have been no problem. We would have just rolled back 5 feet before the dissolve wasn't working, press your button and redo it, which we would do today. So technology has certainly improved dubbing.
And what about the sound recording side? Since obviously the Niagara 3, I mean, what was the first enabled a lot of the documentary films to be made, the Niagara 3, for instance, the NPR?
The Niagara's revolutionised everything. Because, apart from anything else, I should go back a bit, but I mean, originally, in the days of the soundtrack, the camera was run from the batteries in the soundtrack to keep sync. And you had to run a cable we had to run a cable, even in the studio, you had to run a cable to the camera. And for some reason, it was always the sound department's responsibility to run that cable to the camera. Whether it was in the studio, it ran off 3-phase, or from the soundtrack, it would run off either 3-phase or whatever system there was, interlock. Western Electric used a different system. Now, with the pulse system, you still had to run a cable originally from the camera to the Niagara to get the pulse. But then they came in with a crystal control, and wonderful freedom. You had no link between the camera and the recorder. So you were free to just walk off and do a wild track or something like that.
But also it gave you the freedom on pictures that you've done out of Africa and Gorillas in the Mist, where you're 2 miles up a mountain or something. In order, if you know, in the old days with the soundtrack that used to weigh 5 ton, it's impossible. Now it might be humping, but you sling a Niagara over your shoulder and some microphones, and it makes it practical and feasible to film where the director wants to film, not with the constrictions of we can't get that soundtrack up there, Gav.
The only problem was that when the soundtrack went and the large mixers went, a lot of the mystique went out of sound recording, and your prestige on the floor went down at the same time, because you couldn't fool anybody anymore. You were just sitting there in front of an Niagara or something like that, and it all looked so easy. I mean, in fact, it was no easier, but it looked a lot easier. In the days of optical sound, if something went wrong, you held up production. You'd say, well, I'm terribly sorry, we've got to put this right, and maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, and everyone would wait. They might get a bit irritated, but there was nothing else they could do. I mean, with a Niagara, you'd take 2 Niagaras, and if one doesn't work, you swap it with the other one and repair the one that's gone wrong. You couldn't do that with an enormous amount of optical recording equipment.
And also with optical recording equipment, there are inherent problems in recording onto optical, particularly level-wise and frequency-wise. So you had to be disciplined on how much level you put, and you had a controlled track when you're recording. There's so much more latitude and headroom on magnetic that you can give to an inexperienced person a Niagara or a tape machine, and he can go out and yes, he can sling a microphone and he'll get something come onto that soundtrack. But it doesn't show up later that when you join all those soundtracks together, the different variances from shot to shot that happens, and the work that you have to do in order to level them up and get them to sound as just one equal track, which in the old days, when they were shooting onto optical, and the mixers were more experienced in giving you a controlled track.
It had to be. I mean, much more disciplined.
They're all looking, and now they start.
Horses.
Well, this is the part that we got Tony back from location hunting for Laughter in the Dark. that we were dubbing on the Sunday prior to the premiere on the Thursday, which probably in modern days is par for the course, but it was quite close then because of all the processing that had to be gone through after we'd finished.
A lot of the horses were recorded on location. Some of them sink, some I did in Turkey, and others I did on Chobham Common in Surrey.
So it's an international horse track.
Very much so. And some of that terrible noise was done by torturing a pig.
What the devil's the matter with Cardigan? Outflank those guns now, damn you, not charge them. He's jumping into the wrong valley.
And the explosions.
The explosions were done all over
Salisbury
the
Plain,
place.
wasn't it?
Yeah, Salisbury Plain, and Simon did a lot on location. And some of the a lot of the guns were faked up from more modern guns by altering the speed of the tape and different equalization and all that sort of thing to make them sound, even though they may not be authentic, they sounded authentic for the period.
But the muskets were real.
The muskets
they were real
muskets
muskets.
were real.
It was on this reel more than any reel that we needed advice, because there was also more music written, and it was a question of how much we played it on just the noises of the horses, a combination of horses and music only. That we disturbed Tony from his location hunting to give us his input.
The shell bursts and the shell whistles were Salisbury Plain.
They were concerned in those days, I remember, at the screening we gave for what he was then the censor, John Trevelyan, that he was going to object the final scene of a horse that's I think it's cut in half, or his leg or something, which is on the end of this scene. And in fact, they got it from a butcher's in Turkey or somewhere.
Yeah,
Ankara. And they wondered whether they would censor it. And I'm not certain that he actually, because it's not on the screen for long, I'm not actually certain that he saw the shot, but it wasn't censored. But I'm sure the animal rights of today wouldn't approve.
Bugle calls there.
yeah.
I'm not certain whether Jock did those, or whether they were done out there.
No, we did them at Aldershot. We went down with Jock.
Right.
And they did a lot of the military bands at the same time, because typical Tony, he said, go and do it in the open air, and it was December. It got very cold, and Tony said, well, I'll leave it to you, and went home.
I can hear him saying it.
We were freezing. It was the band of the Coldstream Guards, or one of the guards, Roger. Because quite rightly, I mean, they said, well, a military band sounds different outdoors.
Yeah.
Again, a preference for actuality recording.
Oh yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
I mean, you can't get the same effect recording in
Abbey Road.
studio, Abbey Road, or Wembley, or somewhere like that.
It sounds, you can put echoes on it and things like that, but it's not
the same.
It's not the same as the done outside. Those voices there, those shouts there, would have been done in looping an ADR theatre to put over the top of the. You obviously couldn't get the charge and R's and things as it was actually happening, so they are added to the noises of the track, of the horse track.
Some of the voices, Kevin and I went down to Bristol the Bristol
Yes,
Old Vic
that
Theatre
that rings a bell.
students.
Yeah.
We recorded them again in the open air rather than trying to do it in the studio, because it sounds quite different.
Because you've got all those
But
screens.
a lot of drama students who were much more enthusiastic than some crowd artists would be. We spent a couple of days down in Bristol.
Forgotten that.
That's probably enough of that. Could we talk about? Could you talk in general about? I mean, I know it's other people, but the opening of Saturday night and Sunday morning and the way the sound on that works. Do you think? Or?
I certainly
What do
can't
you mean?
recall it. I can't recall it enough to.
Well, I've got it.
The factory, you're talking about the factory?
Yeah. Or the entertainer, is that?
1,000, Albert counting, isn't he? Counting the number.
Yeah, that's right.
1,000, 1,000 and flipping 8, 1,000.
That's right. Well, I've actually got it queued up. I can shove it in, and if you can talk about the way it works or the way you feel that the effect it has. I mean, it's just, I know you didn't record it, but we've got to try and, because I can't go out and get those people as well.
Right.
Is it? What do you feel? Or do you? Just like it's a picnic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Will be, dear, will be. Coming on like a storm. Gorgeous indeed. That is the light brigade.
I think he was always, although he never expressed it, Tony was disappointed that this didn't achieve a commercial success that obviously he hoped that it would do. Although in retrospect now people view it, but it wasn't commercially successful in its day. Although I think it's a great film.
There was a longer version. You did a longer version, did you,
Yeah.
for universities?
Yes.
It's quite shocking realism, really.
Yes.
You've been wounded by a cut across your eye, which is wrong.
This is one when we first ran it. It was totally uncut. It was just joined together in sequences, and it was running about 4 hours long then. And Tony was one of the very few directors who genuinely wanted to know what didn't work for you, as opposed to, oh, isn't it a wonderful picture and everything. When you saw it the first time, he wanted your instant reaction, not the second time you saw it or the third, and you looked at it. He wanted your reaction as almost like a member of the public would see it, and what scenes didn't work for you or what scenes worked for you. And that he didn't want to know what was marvellous about the picture or anything. He wanted to know what parts you were bored with or anything. I mean, genuinely. And there's not that many directors at that stage are ready for that. And he used that in order to focus in. He might not touch a frame on what the parts that you didn't like, but he would then analyse and see whether your first view in criticism had any validity to it. I think he had a group of people that he trusted.
Oh yes, he was great.
And he gave them 100% trust. And it was fantastic working with him. It was probably more than any other director that I've worked with.
Very few like him.
Very, very few.
I can think of only about 3, and 2 of them are American. The job of a production sound mixer is primarily the dialogue. Now you have a problem because you are the audience. And if on the first rehearsal there's a line that you don't think is entirely clear, you watch out for it. But then you can go to the director and say, well, I'm sorry, but that line is not clear. He said, well, I understood it. It's not the point, because he knows the script backwards. You see, and he may well have understood it. But he's predisposed to understand it. And so many directors forget that the audience is going to see the picture for the first time and hear the dialogue for the first time. It's quite different to having lived with the script for 6 months and sat in the dubbing theatre and heard it all over again. I was talking about that to Robin this morning, actually, on one particular picture, which I won't mention because it doesn't matter. It's not a technical fault in that case, but it is a case where the director thinks that a line is clear and in fact it is not.
Because you've got it almost in your memory. You know the script, so you know the word that you hear, and it's only on you've got to remember what you heard or didn't hear on the very first screening, because that's what the public are going to hear. That's all the public are going to hear. So it's a pitfall that you can fall into. Once you've heard it a second time or a third time, that word that you weren't quite certain of the first time round suddenly starts getting clearer to you, and now you remember it, and it's okay. But on the actuality, I mean, Charge, I was, while we were talking, I was trying to think of scenes. There's very few scenes on Charge that we redid for sound. The vast majority of the sound in Charge is real sound that was shot at the time. And a person who followed in his footsteps, and in fact was I think collaborated with him on one picture, like Ken Loach, who goes in for real sound. Kess was the first one I did for him, and
Kess, that was Woodball as well. That was funded by Tony.
That's right.
Helped him out.
That's right. And Ken will real sound. That's what he wants. And for the odd line or two that he might have to do, he'll go and record that outside. If it was filmed outside, and in Kess I can think of 2 or 3 lines that we did. He won't record it inside a theatre. He will go and record it on a Nagra, so he won't have a picture to play back to, but outside, so he can get it. It's a more realistic sound.
Yeah. On Cathy Come Home, some of the dialogue was a bit difficult to hear sometimes.
Yeah.
I thought.
Yes. But there's a case in point that they'd rather go for the real sound rather than a clinical post looping sound.
But on top of that clean sound, you would put in sound effects.
Oh, of course. Oh, yes. You try and build the track up again to mirror what the actual sound was, but it's never ever quite the same. It's you can get the noise because you lay all the effects back in again, and you try and get it as close to the dialogue as possible to make it realistic. But and I mean you can succeed at that, but I'd much prefer to use the original.
But even then, the original would sometimes be treated with additional sound effects.
Oh yes. Oh no, you will add to the original. The scenes in any picture, that the scenes in Charge, where Gielgud was talking away there right up on top prior to the charge. Now you can hear wind noise, and you can hear crows in the background, the bugle sounding in the distance, voices off from the other soldiers which aren't in picture. All those are added. They're not on the original track. The original soundtrack will just be Gielgud's voice talking whatever he's saying there, and then you have some crows crowing, and so you add those in those to make the soundtrack a little more interesting.
Well, you have to. I mean, if you get a scene in a cafe or restaurant, you can't have everybody talking. They have to mime. Obviously, otherwise you'd never hear the dialogue. It would be impossible to cut the scene because the background would change on every cut. So you make the crowd quiet. No clatter of knives and forks, no chat. They have to look animated without making any noise. You record the dialogue, then after that you say, well, now I want a wow track. And you do a track of the crowd separately.
I mean, as a rule, you can always, it's easy to add to a soundtrack. It's not so easy to take away. So if you've got too much noise on a soundtrack, you can't take it away without taking away the dialogue which you want to keep. But if you've got the dialogue nice and clean, you can add all these noises afterwards. The telephone ring in the background, the chatter of people in a restaurant, factory noise, all those things can be added, but you can add them to the level where the dialogue is still acceptable and can be heard by the public. But if you have them there originally, and particularly as Peter has just said, if you've got these, if you do the scene in the restaurant and all the people are talking away and clattering of their noise and everything, knives and forks, by the time you start intercutting, everywhere the levels will be changing, and it would be bumping every time you cut. It would jar, do a sound jar. So you try and get rid of the extraneous noises as much as you can, and then add those later in a controlled way.
So you just have the people in the background opening and closing their mouths, but not actually saying anything.
Absolutely.
That's right, yeah.
Don't have them banging down a cup into a saucer. If they're going to put down a cup, get them to put down lightly, or even put put tape in the saucer so when they put it down it doesn't go clunk, because that clunk could be coming over a line that the artist is giving, and it would interfere with that word. You can always put the noises back on afterwards.
Yes, because this is what interested me about the start of Saturday night and Sunday morning. You can hear him talking over the sound of the machine.
Oh, the machines will be put on afterwards. Machine noise is put on afterwards.
Right.
You get him to just get the talking, get the words. You can add anything you liked afterwards. It won't. It's not all done at the same time.
No, if you look, it's a close-up. It's a close-up of Albert Finney. You don't see the machine really, where he's talking.
Yeah.
You may see a little bit of one machine, but you arrange it so to be running. And then,
Right.
I mean, we did countless soundtracks in the Raleigh factory at Nottingham where we were shooting. But you do that when there's nothing else happening. You go back maybe the next day or...
When you're in a room and there's a fire and you hear the fire crackling away, that wasn't done. That is because you don't want a fire crackling and popping when you've got, because it could be crackling and popping over a line, that you've got to lift that line was low, so you've got to raise it in volume. If you've got the fire noise on the same track, you're raising that fire noise and it would become unacceptable. In fact, it would become too close to you and things. So you put that noise on afterwards, or the wind outside, whatever.
Is this possible to draw attention? For instance, you can car hooting as a cut to another scene of the car moving along.
Oh, certainly. Doing yesterday, albeit the German version, Far and Away, you see them where they're all galloping along in order to stake their claims on the land, and really in the distance you see a person being shot, and you hear the noise of the shot, and without the noise of the shot, I don't think your eye would go to this scene, because there's a lot of things happening on the screen. But with the noise of the shot on it, then you just see this happening in the background. So in order to focus your attention onto something, it can help.
Sound can add to the tapestry and work in with the vision.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, basically, I was. It's a visual medium. I once said this to a director. I said, "Well, it's a visual medium, and we're in second place, the sound." And he said, "Oh, and he was sort of disagreed with me, but I still, it is a visual. The information from the eye gets to the brain quicker than from the ear." So the cinema audience sees the picture on the screen. Now, some of them are not aware to a good or a bad soundtrack. They're getting the information, the basic information that is the dialogue, and they're not aware that maybe their emotions are being manipulated by, say, music.
Oh, yes.
An obvious.
Yeah.
Say that they'll come out and they'll have their Kleenex and they'll be dabbing their eyes. Now that's probably because the heroine has just died, but also the music has enhanced it. They're not really aware that they've been manipulated. Why should a 80-piece orchestra suddenly appear in this bedroom and be doing a schmaltzy tune? So yes, sound does, obviously, one certainly hopes so, enhance the visual.
Vision speaks, sound amplifies is what they said about it.
Yeah. Have you seen Howard's End?
That's bits of it, yeah.
Have you seen the scene in the bedroom, which is by a railway?
Yes.
Well, I mean, you see what they do with the flashing lights for a passing train. You also see a shot of a low-angle shot of a railway viaduct, which in fact is the Southern Railway out of Waterloo. But the soundtrack is, I know because it's from our library, several trains going through Hitchin in 1956. Now, I mean, if you'd not added that track, the whole point of the visual thing would have been lost, because it doesn't really show what's happening, but with immediately you add the soundtrack, it adds reality that this apartment is right below a railway embankment.
Picture Julia, from the moment that Jane Fonda gets on the train, which they shot at the railway station in Paris to go to Berlin. That's all shot on the stage at Elstree Studios, but all the noises obviously added later. The clickety-clickety-click of the railways, and the whooshes when you go under a bridge, and all the other noises. They didn't. She wasn't on any. There was no location of her on a train on that. Yet you see the film. Not only that, but Fred Zinnemann did it. He didn't even do it to plates. He did it the old-fashioned way of a drum, with painted telegraph posts, which just turned round and round and round like they used to do in the old cowboy days with stagecoaches. And that, if you look at Julia, all the flashing backgrounds on that is a drum on the stage at Elstree Studios. And I'd seen the reels certainly half a dozen times, maybe 10 times, and not until he told me. Now I start looking out.
And it doesn't work anymore.
And well, why he did it, and it wasn't for cheapness, because the producer, as Zinnemann told me, the producer went out and he shot the plates, the background plates for that, and although Zinnemann had already, Mr. Zinnemann had already said he was going to do it in this format, which had gone out with high button shoes as far as I was concerned, a big rolling drum with telegraph post painted on, and he remembered as a child that when he sat in a train, the telegraph wires came down, dipped down to the centre and then back up again, so he had those painted like that. And so it gave you the impression of going by them, and he had people turning this big round drum outside the carriage window, which was on the stage. And therefore he wasn't locked into any plates. He could move his camera anywhere he wanted around the carriageway. And I said that the plates were shot, and the producer showed them in the viewing theatre, and he said, yeah, those plates are fine, and if I've changed my mind, those plates will be fine to use, but I'm going to, and this is the way he did it. And you even see, if you see the film, you will see what you think are railway lines as they pull out of the station. In fact, they're the wires, which are the lamps, which the lighting man has got, which again are on a circuit, so that they're to give the impression of lights flashing by the window. And that's what these are, the wires which are controlling those lamps on the stage. And he looks up, so it's.
Because he sent for me to compose the track of the trains. And he said, you have all these tracks of the train, I want you to compose the track. He said, oh, actually it was all shot in France and on the stage. He said, but in fact, if you showed me the picture, you go from Paris to Berlin.
Could we perhaps go into talk? Would you be willing to talk about the entertainer? If I should put a bit of that in there, could you talk about the way the sound was recorded on that?
On the what? On the
entertainer.
Now you know the scene. I mean, there's a big swimming pool competition, isn't there, where you meet Shirley Anfield.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, all the crowd for that, they went out and collected people. They didn't pay anything for a crowd of about 1,000. And they distributed cloakroom tickets as a lottery for a prize, so everybody hoped they would win a prize. That's the way they got a crowd. The band, there was a big procession through the streets, which was a great problem because we had all that noise in the background which you couldn't get rid of. And Olivia was in the doorway with some dialogue with the newspaper reporters. And I had a close mic on him and open mics on the other. So the only way to do it. But suddenly, Olivier said, "Fuck off, the lot of you." So we cut the scene, and I went to Tony, and I mean, in those days, you couldn't say anything like that. You couldn't even hint at it. I said to Tony, "Do you know what he's saying?" He said, "No, tell me what he's saying." I said, "Well, he's saying, fuck off, the lot of you." I said, "There's nothing wrong with that. People say it." I said, "Well, they don't say it in films at the moment." "Oh, well, never mind." He wouldn't retake it.